There's something wrong with this map, and this map, and these maps. Fans have made many maps charting with nerd-level accuracy the known universe of Star Trek. True nerds will point out that space has 3 dimensions, but given that our galaxy is 100 times wider than deep, it's not unreasonable to map its galactic empires on the galactic plane, because these are the territories and borders between the Klingons, Romulans, Cardassians, galactic empires. Or worse.
We are the Borg. Resistance is futile.
The exception is the United Federation of Planets, which, as the name suggests, is not an empire, but a federation. Which is the problem with these maps. If Earth is a relative newcomer among warp-capable civilizations, how is it the center of the Federation? And if the Federation has territories and a Starfleet, is it really not just another empire? The answer is that Star Trek isn't really about the future, and these maps aren't of the galaxy. Star Trek is about the culture that made it, and these maps are maps of its geopolitics, the United States of America. Because Star Trek is propaganda.
We, the people of the United States.
Excuse me? Star Trek liberal propaganda? Are we even watching the same show?
Can we please stop pretending Star Trek isn't a flawless blueprint for fully automated luxury gay space communism?
Okay, sure. Star Trek has a message.
You're probably one of those people who thinks the Prime Directive is woke because it tells white guys not to colonize people with forehead ridges.
The Federation is literally a post-scarcity socialist collective where healthcare is a right and replicators dismantle cis-heteropatriarchy daily. If you don't see that, you're either a class traitor or a Ferengi apologist.
The Ferengi? They're hilarious little space goblins, not a critique of capitalism. Nice try, commies.
Just because they have a diverse crew and allegories for racism doesn't mean it's propaganda. It's just basic human decency.
Gene Roddenberry was a patriot who loved explosions and space flags. Star Trek is not propaganda.
Can you imagine how great it is to sit there and be able to propagandize a whole nation? I propagandize for what I believe in. Propaganda, what I believe art is comment. Whether you work in marble and stone or painting on a canvas or music or what, the whole point of art is you comment on a certain thing. Propaganda has negative tones, so I've seen them shake their head and frown and say, oh God, what an awful thing to have happen. No, it's not an awful thing, because I propagandize for what I believe in. Every other writer and every other person has all the rights in the world to come along and say, he is crazy, here is the way it really is. And another one would say, no, this is the way things are. And it is out of this that our civilization is built, and values and judgment.
This is an essay about Star Trek as propaganda. Because Star Trek is propaganda, Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek as a vision of the future. And as we'll see in this essay, Star Trek has been supported by the American state and corporations to spread that vision. But the real question isn't if Star Trek is propaganda, because Star Trek is propaganda. But what is Star Trek propaganda for? And the answer to that question gets to one of the most important questions facing humankind today. Because the answer is not America. Peak Star Trek was reached in 1992 as the final seasons of Next Generation and early seasons of Deep Space Nine screened back to back. Series creator Gene Roddenberry had died in 1991, but his influence was still paramount. Roddenberry had enforced strict rules on Star Trek writers. There was to be no internal conflict among the Enterprise crew, and humanity was always to be shown as having overcome its baser drives. Roddenberry had guided Trek in his later years by summarily firing writers who missed his high standards. The survivors, including Rick Berman, Brannon Braga, and Ira Stephen Bear, would drive Star Trek forward, preserving Roddenberry's vision while growing it for the 1990s. Original Trek of the 1960s is eerily similar to post-war America. The United Federation of Planets is the United States of America, a new federal power surrounded by old empires. And the USS Enterprise is literally the USS Enterprise. Enterprise NCC 1701 and its warp engines are directly inspired by the Enterprise CVN-65, the first naval supercarrier with nuclear engines. Surrounded by dying empires after World War II, the new federal power of the United States devised a strategy to secure global trade and project military power worldwide with a fleet of supercarriers, much the same purpose for which the Federation built its Starfleet. Star Trek's naval themes were emphasized to rescue the movie franchise in Wrath of Khan. The Cold War analogy of Klingons as the Soviet Union was so stark that the sixth movie, The Undiscovered Country, even blew up the Klingon moon in a clear metaphor for the Chernobyl disaster. Star Trek has continued to mirror the power of the United States. The noughties reboots made a series of cack-handed gestures to the War on Terror under director J.J. Star Destroyer Abrams. And as America descended into culture wars, Alex Kurtzman's various attempts at Star Trek struck a variety of woke poses to cover a fundamental lack of storytelling chops. Enterprise had been crewed by hard-bitten and probably alcoholic naval men. Discovery seemed to be crewed by the post-grad faculty of a liberal arts college. Oh, and when the studio gave up and stopped even pretending this wasn't just chest-thumping pro-American heartland propaganda, as the determinedly atheistic Star Trek crew declared it had faith. But the 1990s, the late seasons of Next Generation, its movies, Generations and First Contact, most of Deep Space Nine's 7 seasons, and some of Voyager, if you can squint hard enough to ignore Neelix. And look, can we just admit that Voyager only struggled through those dull later seasons because certain people were still tuning in for 7 of 9. The 90s remain peak Star Trek. 90s Star Trek was no longer a mission of exploration. Picard's Enterprise is a diplomatic vessel, primarily managing the Federation's diplomatic relationships. Deep Space Nine's mission is quite literally to deal with the fallout of colonization. If Bajor, with its peaceful Vedic religion, is the Hindu culture of the Indian subcontinent, then the Cardassian colonization is the British Raj. In fact, 90s Star Trek constantly contrasted the Federation with the empires that surrounded it. With the Cold War in the rearview mirror, 90s Klingons were retconned as a generic representation of barbarism, plus superb hair. The Ferengi are often cited as a parody of American capitalism. But their mercantilist culture, rules of acquisition, fundamentalist oppression of their females, and face makeup that has been called Jew face are more like a broad parody of how Americans saw the Semitic cultures of the Middle East, and really highlight how easy it is for alien races in sci-fi to become unpleasant cultural stereotypes. Are you hearing this, George? Meanwhile, the Dominion alien shape changers who, after millennia of persecution, have become a militantly expansionist power to secure their homeworld, are probably the Star Trek Empire a good writer would resurrect to be politically relevant here in 2025. The Federation, we are shown again and again by contrast, is superior to the old empires it conflicts with. The Federation seeks not to expand by force, but by voluntary membership of strange new worlds who agree to abide by the Federation's values, while retaining nominal autonomy. Pretty much exactly the offer of America's post-World War II rules-based order. And those values of the Federation are weirdly American, including one notorious episode that pivots on Kirk reading the United States Constitution. The Federation's superiority comes not from any belief in racial superiority. It is a multi-ethnic, diverse and intersectional alliance. The Federation's superiority comes from its values, shared by all its members. Liberal values of equality and freedom, humanist values of the sanctity of life, with or without forehead ridges, values embodied in the federal political structure of the Federation, and in the United States, the culture imagining the Federation. So as the United States of America grew into its role as a global superpower, there was a network TV show about a galactic superpower to show us that American liberal, democratic, humanist values were the universal values of the entire fucking galaxy. And reassure us that the global hegemony we all live under, while not perfect, is fundamentally for the good. And making a good future, like Star Trek. It's a knowing nod to history that we meet the crew of the Enterprise D in their first cinema outing aboard the HMS Enterprise. The first recorded vessel to bear that name was a French 26-gun frigate, L'Enterprise, captured by the English in 1705 and anglicised to Enterprise. 12 HMS Enterprises have served in the Royal Navy in the 3 centuries since, the most recent Echo-class survey vessel being decommissioned in 2023. James T. Kirk's 5-year mission to boldly explore strange new worlds is basically the mission of an HMS Enterprise in the late 1700s. The HMS George was a 10-gun tender captured by the Americans in 1775 that then served in the Revolutionary War as the first USS Enterprise. 9 USS Enterprises have served in the US Navy, including the under construction Gerald R. Ford-class supercarrier, successor to the ship which inspired the Starship Enterprise. In 1976, NASA, in a classic example of hyperstition, fiction shaping reality, named the first space shuttle Enterprise, inspired by the NCC 1701 of Star Trek. I'm not saying the NASA engineers intended this, but I suspect that the era's politicians understood and approved the symbolism, that the power which had launched one enterprise after another to explore and colonize the globe was going to continue on to explore the galaxy, and that the Starship Enterprise is one in a continuous series of vessels taking us towards our Star Trek future, the future of the Federation.
We are all explorers, driven to know what's over the horizon, what's beyond our own shores.
By the 1880s, the British Empire covered a quarter of the world's land mass and 1/5 of its population. And it was very expensive. What the British had learned is that while huge profits could be extracted from its colonies short term, The long-term military expenditure on wars made being an imperial power cripplingly expensive. This lesson was driven home in World Wars I and II, after which Britain basically gave up on being an empire. So through its history, the British Empire considered an alternate structure of power. Plans were considered but declined to give Americans seats in Parliament, leading to the Revolutionary War against taxation without representation. Then more serious plans were debated through the 1800s for a new structure, with all of Britain's colonies represented in a new parliament, governing a global superstate. Some wanted this state to be called Greater Britain, but others suggested a new name reflecting the political structure of this superstate, the Imperial Federation, routinely shortened to the Federation. In Star Trek, the Federation is only able to form after the old empires of Earth have destroyed each other in nuclear war. From that destruction, humanity learns our lesson: that empires must be replaced with federal power structures. Star Trek never tells us anything about the government of Earth, other than it is governed by a unitary world state. Are there elections? Is it a totalitarian bureaucracy? We never know. But there's a credible alternate history where Britain formed the first federal government of Earth, and London remains capital of a federal world state, and perhaps even a galactic federation. Oops, I think I just gave the entire Tory party an orgasm. In fact, it was the Tories who forced Britain instead to declare itself an old-fashioned empire, and destroyed our Star Trek potential while yapping about God Save the King. Nothing changes there then. In fact, many of the values we honour in Star Trek began as pragmatic answers to problems in the British Empire. Those liberal values of diversity, humanism, democracy and more that many of us watching Star Trek might hold as universal goods are also just the provincial values of Anglo-American culture that emerged as pragmatic responses to building a global trading federation. Because this is what's missing from Star Trek. As a mythic representation of the Anglo-American liberal democratic culture that made it. That's the trade, business, the engine that built the Federation. Capitalism. Fairy tales about peasant girls who become princesses always leave something out. Servants. The new princess finds food and drink ready, a bath made, clothes prepared, as if by magic. Capitalism built the power of first Britain, then America. The British Empire was built by private corporations like the East India Company. Much of its wealth came from resource extraction and slavery. But audiences aren't going to sit down to watch Kirk transporting green-skinned slave women between star systems, or Picard putting down a planetary rebellion so Earth corporations can continue extracting rare dilithium crystals. Although these were standard practice for the HMS and USS Enterprises of the past, that as an idealized fantasy of Anglo-American culture colonizing the stars, Star Trek has to ignore. And so capitalism is nowhere to be seen in Star Trek. Instead, the economics of Star Trek are simply absent, explained away with hand-wavium technologies of matter replication, achieving post-scarcity and abundance, aka space magic. The next generation makes explicit an idea implicit in original Star Trek, an idea which leads many to believe that the universe of Star Trek is socialist or even communist. Star Trek has achieved a post-scarcity civilization of abundance, and capitalism has been abandoned. In a famous episode of Next Generation, Picard spars with a capitalist from 20th century
The
Earth.
24th century, material needs no longer exist.
Then in First Contact, Picard again asserts that Earth and the Federation no longer use money.
Economics of the future are somewhat different. Money doesn't exist in the 24th century. We work to better ourselves.
In the animated spin-off show Below Decks, a new Federation planet is given matter replicators and instantly abandons capitalism for higher pursuits. And sure, for a very naive dream of communism as a future where space magic fulfills all material needs, then okay. Liberal ideology is built on the concept of development. Human civilization develops through stages, and that development is driven by technology. In Star Trek, this is why the Enterprise assesses alien civilizations on their technological development. The baseline is the attainment of warp technology, which determines the application or not of the Prime Directive.
The Prime Directive is not a matter of degrees. It is an absolute.
Again, the Federation's relationship to less developed civilizations is an idealization of the real actions of Anglo-American civilization. In shocking news, Britain believed its colonial activities were for the good, that Britain was advancing its colonies through the stages of development. The United States has very similar beliefs about its global role, embodied until recently in organizations like USAID and the idea of international development.
Sophistry.
So the Prime Directive is a nod by Star Trek's writers to the hypocrisy of Anglo-American international relations, because high ideals often cover for low motivations. The Federation bans itself from any intervention until these civilizations have warp drive, indicating they have reached a mature level of technological development. The matter replicators of Star Trek have become the pop culture shorthand for the liberal belief that human development is a product of technology, and that technology will eventually end material scarcity and bring about the abundant future of Star Trek.
Not bad.
Actual socialism sees post-scarcity and abundance very differently. Humanity could have had widespread abundance at many points in our history, at any stage of technological development, simply by sharing our resources fairly, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. And our technology would have developed faster had we helped our fellow humans to fulfill their creative potential, rather than exploiting them as labor. Socialism is the political process of transforming human social relations to stop the exploitation that has plagued human history. Without a transformation of human social relations, even matter replicators won't end scarcity, because capitalism will still capitalize excess value into the hands of the elites. And let's be honest, this is how Star Trek presents communism.
We are the Borg. Resistance is futile.
Calling Star Trek socialist is truly perverse, because far from achieving the anarchist or cooperative power relations of a socialist future, Star Trek is mired in top-down, hierarchical relations of our past.
Starfleet is not a military organization. Its purpose is exploration.
Star Trek itself mocks the dull, repetitive duties of the lower decks crew in a famous Next Generation episode, and calls out Riker's authoritarian managerial style.
Jazz. Give me warp in the factor of 5, 6, 7, 8.
Starfleet, whatever it might claim about science as its primary mission, is a military organization and it operates on a corporate structure. Picard, Riker, and Troy are the C-suite execs of a mid-size enterprise, with the crew of Starfleet as the professional managerial class who work in those enterprises. Graduates of Earth's most elite institution, nonetheless stuck operating the same scanning device shift after shift. The writers of Next Generation often parodied their own creation, and never more harshly than when Wesley Crusher, after years of being hothoused by Picard,
To answer.
But shut up, Wesley.
bailed out of his PMC career path to do yoga and mindfulness meditation. Become a space hippie. Picard's brooding irritation with Wesley never entirely dissipates, because Jean-Luc has dedicated his life to becoming a higher kind of man, a path he believes Wesley has abandoned. And perhaps Picard is a little scared that Wesley's path may actually be higher.
You knew what you had to do. I just made sure that you listened to yourself.
Starfleet Academy is a heightened representation of the elite colleges that, whatever liberalism says about equality between all men, really characterize its true beliefs. Starfleet Academy graduates are, with few exceptions, the only humans with any power in Star Trek, in much the same way elite college graduates are almost exclusively the only people with any power in American culture. Because at the heart of Star Trek is a belief in a higher kind of human.
Yes.
Yes, I recall many episodes of being up on bombing missions and having Zeros belly roll in at it with their guns going. But somehow when you're young, you have no fear of death. I didn't feel that I was on the front line of America's defense. Perhaps I'd read too much. I felt there were some really phony things about the war. I did lose some airplanes, two. I flew 87 missions. Scariest things that ever happened to me came some years later when I was flying for Pan America, and I remember I was wakened by the alarm bell. I opened the curtains of the bunk and it looked like the whole left side of the airplane was on fire. We ultimately crashed in the desert. We were at 21,000 feet and it just seemed to take forever to get down. There was panic in the cabin, and I can understand why. There certainly was in the cockpit, although controlled. And in my heart, there certainly was. And I remember walking down the aisle of the airplane, trying to tell people in as calm as possible a voice that it looks worse than it is. And I was in the third to last row of seats when the airplane hit. And my images of that are looking out a window, seeing the cartwheel for a quarter mile across the desert. I remember a great flaming pool of gasoline, a glimpse of bodies writhing in the fire as they were burning. And 9 of us got out. And something happened to me that had a big influence on my life. I thought, well, maybe you just ought to pray. And I remember thinking that, wait a minute, you don't ordinarily pray. And I wouldn't have much respect for a God that would accept your prayers when you were in dire straits like this. And so I remember making up my mind not to pray. I just said, okay, take me as I am. And I've always been rather proud of that. You might call that dire emergency. And if you believe something in a dire emergency, it's probably what you truly believe.
Gene Roddenberry, creator of Star Trek, flew 89 combat missions in World War II, piloting his B-17 bomber Yankee Doodle in missions in a war that almost destroyed humanity. After the war, Roddenberry, interested in becoming a screenwriter, joined the Los Angeles Police Department to gain relevant experience for writing cop shows, which he began to do freelance. Roddenberry was a passionate science fiction reader. In the 1950s, pulp sci-fi had become a serious literature, with Isaac Asimov's Foundation saga a major influence on the Federation, showing that SF could model the rise and fall of civilizations on a galactic scale. By the time Roddenberry had the seniority to pitch his show, he had seen much of the darkness of life and experienced the near destruction of human civilization.
Hey, wait, Roddenberry, how can you say that it's all just beginning for us when you've gone ahead and wrote shows like Genesis 2 and others, which have said that our technological civilization that we enjoy now is probably going to crumble? And in answer, while writing the original Star Trek format, I never considered for a moment that the USS Enterprise and the Federations and the thing represented by that were necessarily a direct and interrupted outgrowth of our present civilization with its heavy emphasis on material things.
And so Star Trek became a vision of a better human civilization, set after a global war has destroyed the old world, amongst the future mythos of sci-fi, in which the darkness Roddenberry had experienced in humanity is defeated by a higher humanity.
That's my name. You want me to tell you the plot of Star Trek 4? That's about it. Events place us in jeopardy.
He wouldn't come out now.
He's a hero in the classical sense. He is the manifestation of the Greek hero today, I feel. The original Genesis was Captain Horatio Hornblower, and I think that that's the soldier philosopher, what they taught, is what I've striven for.
Matter transporters, phaser beams, and warp engines are the higher technology that fascinate many sci-fi fans. But what makes the higher civilization of Star Trek possible is a higher humanity. Star Trek's captains, starting with Kirk, then Picard, Sisko, and Janeway, are philosopher kings, leaders who dedicate their lives to wisdom, foregoing family and ordinary lives for a higher calling. Plato, in his Republic, the first great work of political philosophy, describes an ideal human society governed by philosopher kings. Star Trek never really shows us what the rest of humanity are doing, but the higher humanity who make it into Starfleet, and especially Jean-Luc Picard, are the epitome of Plato's ideal. Despite, or perhaps because of its high idealism, original Star Trek struggled. In its second season, Roddenberry recruited many famous science fiction writers, including the legendary Harlan Ellison, who had the skills to realize the Star Trek vision. Nonetheless, the show was unofficially cancelled, moved to a dead zone in the TV schedules, struggled through a low-quality third season, and as cast and crew jumped ship, original Star Trek died, and was resurrected in 1979, soon after the success of Star Wars. It's notable that the two great Star franchises are the same story from different sides. Trek is the founding and management of a galactic empire. Wars is the rebellion against that empire. Wars show the supercarrier bombing the rebels blown apart. Trek puts us on board the supercarrier with its crew. Check out my friend Feral Historian's detailed analysis of the other empires the Federation resembles. Star Trek the motion picture missed the real character of Trek, but its new ship design, effects and musical score would carry over to Wrath of Khan, establishing the modern franchise. There's a strong argument that Next Generation in 1988 is the Star Trek that Star Trek was always meant to be. The crew of Enterprise were the paragons of new humanity Roddenberry had envisioned. Next Generation also struggled in its first season, but into seasons 2 and 3 began to fulfill the promise of Star Trek, as better writers began to inject some humanity into Roddenberry's vision of a better humanity. Because the crew of the Enterprise D are much more like men of antiquity than humans of the future. The Platonic philosopher king, the stoic ideal of Marcus Aurelius, the rigorous rationality of the Enlightenment, and tying it all together, the virtue ethics of Aristotle. Again and again, we see that the Enterprise crew triumph not via mindlessly following a deontological moral code. Even the Prime Directive is set aside when necessary, or by maximizing utilitarian value. The one often, sometimes, outweighs the needs of the many. The Enterprise crews triumph by developing their own best destiny and higher character. Virtue ethics have an eternal appeal, but they come as a package with darker aspects of the human personality. In the Mirror Universe, Star Trek encounters its shadow self, the violent and oppressive Terran Empire. First appearing in original Star Trek, the Mirror Universe recurs in almost every iteration of Star Trek and becomes increasingly central to the Trek universe. Mirror Universe characters are recognizable by their somewhat more revealing costumes, notable facial hair, and heightened sexual libido, letting actors like Nana Visitor display their range. And the Mirror Universe displays the anger, violence, hatred, and jealousy, and murderous rage that the real Kirk, Sisko, and yes, even Picard would have to possess. But not Janeway. Captain Janeway is actually a perfect human. Aristotle's virtue ethics was written for slave owners. Enlightenment rationality drove centuries of colonialism, and Marcus Aurelius, the true philosopher king, murdered millions to build his empire. The higher humanity that Star Trek idealized, in reality, cannot be detached from its shadow. Recombine the main and mirror verses in a transporter incident, and you would have something like the reality of which Star Trek is the ideal. Or if the Terran Empire made a propagandistic TV show for the citizens of Earth to reassure us about the virtues of our military, it would look just like Star Trek.
Well, I think if you're asking, is the medium television medium potentially dangerous to us? I think potentially anything of that power can be highly dangerous. I think it is dangerous right now. Television appeals to the television is beamed now to uncommitted people with malleable minds. Any device that can take a slogan like "ring around the collar" and send people charging down to their market to buy a new type of soap has got to be able to affect people in even much more powerful ways, and that does work. Otherwise, you wouldn't be putting these millions of dollars in advertising.
In their book Manufacturing Consent, Edward S. Herman and the philosopher Noam Chomsky describe how marketing, advertising, and the PR industries shape mass media into a mechanism of propaganda within the United States. When Star Trek returned in Next Generation, it became massively popular with advertisers, hence its peak in the 90s.
Large corporate advertisers on television will rarely sponsor programs that engage in serious criticisms of corporate activities, such as the workings of the military-industrial complex.
Propaganda in a capitalist state is less often dictated by the government or the military, although both retain this capacity. Instead, it is primarily shaped by corporations via their expenditures on marketing and advertising. Star Trek by the 1990s was aligned with the neoliberal values that now dominated American culture. But it was also a positive depiction of corporate and, crucially, military power. It ticked all of corporate America's boxes, and they spent heavily on Trek-related advertising.
The mass media serve to amuse, entertain, and inform, and to inculcate individuals with the values that will integrate them into the larger society. In a world of concentrated wealth and major conflicts of class interest, to fulfill this role requires systematic propaganda.
Entertainment and the entertainment industry are central to capitalist propaganda because entertainment requires, in Chomsky's words, neither evidence nor logic. So Star Trek can present an idealized vision of the United States military and a post-scarcity future using hand-wavium technology and without presenting any evidence, logic, or reasoned argument. These sci-fi visions can shape the values of the public. The essence of Chomsky's argument is captured in the book's title. The purpose of propaganda in a capitalist democracy isn't to force people to agree with the actions of the corporate state, but to influence the basic values of the people, so that when actions are taken, your consent has already been manufactured. And in the 20th century, Star Trek as propaganda has helped to manufacture the consent of Western audiences for a variety of liberal policies. Post-scarcity as a vision of our future underpins the neoliberal economic policies deployed in the 80s and 90s, decades of peak Star Trek. If human civilization could attain post-scarcity from technology, then all effort should be put into that. And things that might be slowing down technological development, like pesky labor laws, unions, social security, etc., should be cut away. The neoconservative wing of liberalism argued that for the universal values of liberalism, democracy, and the federal government to reach everyone, it would be necessary to fight a few wars. And if those wars happen to align with the capitalist priorities of various major corporations and the military-industrial complex, well, what was the harm, right?
The beauty of the system, however, is that such dissent and inconvenient information are kept within bounds and at the margins, while their presence shows that the system is not monolithic.
Star Trek can show many dissenting and inconvenient facets of the Federation. It can show the Maquis fighting for freedom and the paradoxes of Federation power. But it would never show a group of red shirts massacring a village of Bajorans they were meant to protect. Because dissent is useful, but only within strict bounds.
What about a war? If generations of conflict is killing millions, do we interfere?
There is a United States that understands itself as a nation like any other nation, with borders and citizens, and an extensive global empire that it profits from. Call this America, America. But there is another United States that sees itself as a federal superstate, that is a stage on from the brutal empires of the past and towards a federal world state enforcing universal values of liberal democracy. Call this America the Federation. Star Trek has been a very important part of how the Federation has built itself, a mythic narrative that sold an idealized vision of a post-scarcity future among the stars to Americans sick of living in America and longing to be citizens of the Federation. It's not much of an exaggeration to say that Star Trek is propaganda for the Federation. Increasingly, these two Americas are now at war. Donald Trump's America isn't interested in a post-scarcity future. It wants to pillage the American empire and keep the American people in the poverty that makes men like Donald wealthy. And the rest of the world isn't entirely on board with liberal democracy as universal values of the good. Especially when the Anglo-American empire that built the international rules-based order so rarely sticks to the rules. But if not the Federation, then what? The total war of Chancellor Putin's Klingon Empire, the oppressive surveillance state of the People's Communist Party of Romulus. As Admiral James T. Kirk often stated, the Federation is the worst form of galactic governments ever tried, except for all the others.
Fire. Fire.
William Shatner's stage debut was in Julius Caesar. So to conclude, I will paraphrase Shakespeare's play. I come here not to bury Star Trek, but to praise Roddenberry. I've critiqued every aspect of Star Trek and the Federation I can, ultimately to reinforce this argument. Star Trek is propaganda for the values of an Anglo-American empire that has failed to meet its own values at almost every turn. But Star Trek is also propaganda for a higher vision of a better future, embodied in the officers of Starfleet and in the Federation. Gene Roddenberry was an exceptional human and an underestimated storyteller whose vision had a vast impact on the world. His belief in virtue ethics may have been a little one-sided. His vision of a higher human potential, a little naive. But Star Trek remains the most aspirational and attainable vision of a better human future ever articulated. And as we face the chaos of the 21st century ahead of us, a century that will, at the very least, confront us with climate disaster, population collapse, war waged with weapons of incomprehensible power, and the emergence of AI. A century in which humanity will, in my belief, either attain a higher stage of civilization, somewhat like Star Trek, or be destroyed entirely. The future of Star Trek, Starfleet, and the Federation may be the best destiny we can aim for. Federal world government future, or complete destruction in total war between dying empires? If I have to choose from these options, I choose the Federation. But I don't believe in no-win scenarios. For my answer to this civilizational Kobayashi Maru, learn about the culture of Ian M. Banks.